Week 6. Facing your fears. Last week we addressed time and task management, including a structured plan for getting things done, as well as ways to overcome common barriers. We're now ready to tackle the final major task for this program, how to face your fears. But first, let's revisit some familiar themes from previous chapters as we see how things went over the past week. You had 3 main goals for last week: continuing to complete enjoyable and important activities, addressing problematic thoughts, and working on ways to manage your time and tasks. Hopefully by now you're on a roll with your activity completion. If you continue to struggle, return to week 2 and review the principles as needed. In your notebook, briefly review your successes and any challenges in this area from the past week. Over the coming weeks, continue to complete activities from your list. If there are some 3s you haven't gotten to, consider adding them to your schedule. Also, choose 3 days to monitor your activities using the daily activities form in your bonus materials. In the past week, did you catch yourself thinking things that weren't supported by facts? Record the kinds of thoughts you noticed and challenged. By now, you may be at a point where you can begin to dismiss thoughts more efficiently, without going through the full evidence-finding exercise. It's usually helpful to have something to say in response to the thoughts. For example, in week 4, we saw how Alex, when she caught herself having an inaccurate thought, would say things like, "Someone's lying about me again." Other possibilities include 1. There go my thoughts. 2. Okay, back to reality. 3. Thank goodness that's not true. 4. Not everything you think is true. The options are endless. Just find something that resonates with you. In the coming week, continue to notice if and when your thoughts aren't helping you. If you can't easily dismiss a troubling thought, plan to complete a challenging your thoughts form for it. If you plan to complete some tasks using specific strategies for time and task management, how well did you follow the plan you laid out for yourself? Did anything go worse than expected or better? If you struggle to stick to the plan you set for yourself, what got in the way? If you found yourself struggling, consider reviewing week 5. You might return to the section on barriers and see if any of them apply. If so, review possible ways to remove barriers. In the coming week, continue to follow the plan for listing, prioritizing, and scheduling your tasks. It can take repeated attempts to push through avoidance and start being more productive. Practice being patient with yourself as you find what works for you. Facing fears. I realized that in some way, this fear has affected every part of my life. Julie first experienced social anxiety in 7th grade. Now 27 years old, she's been struggling with it for more than half her life. As she tells me all the social situations she's afraid of, it's a little hard to square with the confident and articulate young woman with a quick sense of humor who is sitting in front of me. I tell her as much. It's not everywhere, she tells me. I know you're not going to judge me. It's whenever I'm talking with someone who might think I'm stupid or awkward. She pauses, then continues. The weird thing is, I know I'm not stupid or awkward. I mean, I know it now, but as soon as I'm around someone new, or I have to speak in front of a group, or I'm on a date, I seize up. It's like the spotlight's on me, someone hands me a mic, and I forgot to prepare my speech. She's been working since college at a tech startup, and she's been recognized for doing good work. Kevin, the senior member of her team, has let her know he's impressed with her innovative ideas and encouraged her to speak up about them in their team meetings. Try as she might, Julie can't bring herself to volunteer her ideas in front of the team. She was mortified when Kevin asked her why she didn't give her input more in meetings, and she had to admit that she struggles with confidence when speaking in a group. She can feel him looking at her now in meetings when he asks if anyone else has any suggestions. She often feels caught between his gentle but persistent pressure to speak and her paralyzing social anxiety. Recently, Kevin told her he wants to recommend her for an exciting new project, but he's concerned about her ability to lead a group. Julie is secretly relieved. She has major concerns about leading a group, especially the talking in front of the group part. At the same time, she wants to move up in her field, and it would be a great opportunity. Besides, she's not dating, also because of her social anxiety, so she could use a bigger challenge at work. Once again, she feels trapped between wanting to avoid social situations that terrify her and being stuck at a level below her potential. In this chapter, we'll address how to face fears like the ones Julie has. While she struggles with social anxiety, the principles we'll cover apply to all types of fears. The techniques we'll focus on are based on the principle that the most effective way to overcome our fear is to expose ourselves to the situations that trigger it. Thus, this treatment approach is called exposure. Exposure therapy is used for facing situations we truly fear. If you struggle with major fears, the cognitive work you've done so far will be helpful. Challenging the validity of our fears can be a crucial step toward facing them. It's unlikely to get rid of our fears, but once we realize our fears probably aren't warranted, we tend to be more willing to confront them directly. Take a moment to think about your own fears. Write down what your main fears are. Do these fears get in the way of living your life to the fullest? Principles of facing fears. In the first few sessions, Julie and I developed a plan for moving toward her goals. We examined the thoughts she had about social situations, especially the predictions she made for how things would go in specific encounters. Over time, she realized there was probably not as much to fear as she thought. For instance, she didn't judge people harshly, even when they did something a little foolish, so she had little reason to assume others were being highly critical of her. At this point, it was time for Julie to face her fears directly. We began by reviewing the principles of facing our fears. Why do something that we know is going to make us uncomfortable? Anxiety goes down. If we felt just as scared every time we faced our fears, it'd be hard to make the case for doing so. Why suffer if we don't have to? Fear is based on an expectation that something is dangerous. When we face a scary situation and nothing bad actually happens, our brains acquire new information about that situation. This way, when we face our fears, they diminish. Generally, we don't have to talk ourselves into being less afraid. Just by doing what we're afraid of, it gets easier. For example, I used to have a big fear of spiders. One fall, a large orb-weaving spider built its web in the doorframe of my garage. Every morning, I'd pass the spider on my way through the garage. The first few times I saw it, I was really nervous and walked past it as quickly as possible, half expecting it to jump on me. Over a few weeks, I came to fear the spider less and eventually even felt friendly toward it. I was actually sorry when it stopped building its web there and I never saw it again. After that experience, I was no longer so afraid of spiders when I'd see them. Think of a time you faced your fears and they diminished. Write it down. Working through anxiety from the ground up. Years ago, I provided treatment for Ron, a middle-aged man dealing with panic attacks. When I described the process of gradually confronting our fears, he gave me a metaphor that stuck with me. Ron had had a fear of heights when he was a younger man. When he was in his 20s, he was working construction in a small town where most of the buildings were only 2 or 3 stories tall, so his fear of heights was not much of an issue. When he moved to a city where the jobs were bigger, he knew he'd be working on taller buildings and worried he might not be able to do it. One of his first jobs was helping to build a 16-story building. Ron was sure he'd have to find a different project to work on, but thankfully for Ron, buildings are built from the ground up. In the beginning, he was working below ground as the foundation went in, then on the ground level in the weeks that followed. When they began work on the second floor, he was a little nervous, but got used to it fairly quickly. The third floor wasn't much worse than the second, and soon he was comfortable working at that height. By the time the building was halfway up, I knew I was going to be fine, Ron told me. It did take some getting used to each time we'd go up a little higher, but I'd had enough experience to know I'd be okay by the second or third day. Now I don't really worry about heights. Ron's experience is a perfect application of exposure. What principles do you recognize that made his treatment effective? When facing fears, use common sense. Naturally, the process of facing our fears is helpful only for things that aren't truly dangerous. Approaching an angry, stinging insect or venomous snake would not provide a positive learning experience. Keep in mind, the activities you choose should be relatively safe. While there's a certain level of risk involved in any activity, even getting out of bed in the morning, the things you choose should not present more danger than our normal day-to-day activities. Make it progressive. Julie decided that the only way she was going to get to a better place was to face her fears directly. We developed a list of social situations Julie was afraid of and rated each one for how much anxiety she would experience while doing it on a scale from 0 to 10. The activities ranged from things she was doing already to ones that were difficult for her to imagine doing. We then arranged her activities into a hierarchy. An abbreviated version looked like this. Activity, distress level from 0 to 10. Activity, giving a presentation at work. Distress level 9. Going on a date, 8. Going out with friends from work, 7. Speaking up in team meetings, 6. Going to a movie with a friend, 5. Telling supervisor my ideas, 4. And finally, the activity of making conversation with grocery cashier, distress level 2. As you're hearing about her hierarchy, Julie's activities range from low to high anxiety, from bottom to top, and there are no big jumps between levels. Ideally, we want to create a hierarchy like a ladder with rungs that are relatively evenly spaced. Think about your own fears. What are some activities that would allow you to face them incrementally? Write your thoughts down in your journal. Do it on purpose. I understand the idea of exposure, Julie told me as we were planning which activities to begin with. But why am I afraid of the things I'm already doing? I mean, it's not like I never talk in group meetings, and I tell my supervisor my ideas. Can you tell me about a time recently when you spoke in a group meeting? I asked. Sure, she said. Kevin asked each of us to give an update on how our project was going. When my turn came, I was really nervous, but I said what I had to and felt like I did an okay job. Is that how it usually goes? I asked her. When you speak up, is it usually because you have to, or do you do it voluntarily? She thought about it and said, I guess it's pretty much only when I'm really expected to. I mean, I don't tend to say things out of the blue. I'd be afraid people would think it was a dumb idea and that I should have just kept it to myself. Julie's example raises an important point. Exposure needs to be done on purpose to be most effective. Intentionally defying our desire to avoid our fears sends a powerful message to our brains. Maybe we don't have to be so afraid. After all, how bad can it be if I'm facing it deliberately? Choosing to face our fears is more effective than facing them against our will or with limited choice in the matter. For these reasons, exposure is never something that can be done to us, like forcing a person to touch a snake. Consider times when you encountered the things you were afraid of without trying to. How helpful was it in reducing your fear? Repeat as needed. I did it, Julie told me the following week. I went out with some of my coworkers, and it went pretty well. None of the major disasters I was afraid of actually happened. Great, I said. What did you learn from this experience? Well, maybe I shouldn't be so nervous in these situations. But then again, it was only one time and maybe I just got lucky. Maybe with a different mix of people or different topics of conversation, or if I'm feeling tired, it could go really badly. As Julie found, doing something one time is an act of courage, but it's not therapy. The therapy comes in repeating the activities until we start to feel more comfortable doing them. Our nervous systems usually don't stop being afraid of a situation after facing it one time, and for good reason. We've all probably done something dangerous one time and gotten away with it, and realized immediately after how lucky we were. It takes repetition to dampen our fears. Additionally, our repeated exposures need to be relatively close together in time. For example, many people are afraid of flying. If they have family far away, they may fly once a year for the holidays. Repeating an exposure, in this case flying once per year, is typically not enough to make any difference in our level of fear. Flying several times relatively close together in time can make a big difference. Stay through the discomfort. What happened this week when you went out with friends from work? I asked Julie. There were a few moments when I really wanted to get out of there. I went to the bathroom at one point and thought, you could just slip out the back door. Probably no one would even notice. "What stopped you?" I asked. She smiled. "Well, for one, I knew we'd had this conversation, and I didn't want to say I ran away. And more than that, I'm tired of running away. I've been running from my fears, but I'm also running away from life. How am I ever going to meet someone and fall in love if I can't get through this fear?" Because Julie stayed, she found that she didn't have to escape when things got tough. She also saw that her wave of anxiety passed. In the past, she'd always thought that escaping the situation was her only way to relieve her distress. As we work through our hierarchy, it's important that we stay in a situation long enough to learn something new. If we run away at the first feeling of discomfort, we'll be reinforcing our avoidance behavior and the belief that had we stayed, things could have been really bad. It's nice if our fear goes down during the exposure itself, although, as recent research by Michelle Krask and others has shown, it doesn't have to for the exercise to be helpful. Are there situations you fled because you had a spike in your anxiety? What do you think would have happened had you stayed? Eliminate unnecessary props. "I'm realizing how much of what I've been doing isn't necessary," Julie told me. "For instance, I always thought I had to type out a draft of what I was going to say in our team meetings. I'd go over it beforehand and memorize it as best I could. But then when I was talking, I'd either read what I'd written, which didn't make me sound very dynamic, or I'd try to remember it and get flustered if I forgot." Julie described other things she would do to prevent her fears from coming true. For example, when she got together with friends, she preferred to go to a movie instead of dinner to avoid the possibility of awkward silences. I asked her what she's learned from letting go of some of these behaviors. "I feel like Dumbo," she said. I looked at her quizzically, and she continued, "He could fly because he had huge ears, but he thought he could fly because of the magic feather his friends gave him. All these props were my magic feathers, and like Dumbo, if I dropped my feather, I thought I was sunk, like when I couldn't remember the words I'd memorized. Now I can speak up in a meeting and just do my best, and so far it's gone fine." What Julie was describing, her magic feathers, have been called safety behaviors because they intended to protect us in situations where we're anxious. As Julie discovered, most of the time these behaviors are not necessary, and they can even be detrimental. For example, a man might memorize a list of questions to ask his date in case there's a lull in the conversation. Instead of having a natural conversation, he might end up cutting off interesting topics of conversation and asking a series of non sequiturs. Even when safety behaviors don't lead to negative results, they can still come with a cost. We can tell ourselves that things might have gone very badly if I hadn't done those things. In this way, we prevent ourselves from learning that we can face our fears without additional props. Think about your own feared situations and things you might do to prevent what you're afraid of from happening. Do any of these behaviors strike you as unnecessary safety behaviors that you could consider dropping? Record your thoughts in your notebook. Embrace discomfort and uncertainty. "How'd your presentation go?" I asked Julie. She had worked up to the highest item on her hierarchy, which involved giving a presentation about her team's project in front of the entire firm. "Worse than I expected," she told me, "and yet better than I expected." She continued, "I thought it was just going to be the people in our firm, but before the meeting, Kevin pulled me aside and told me it was also going to be a kind of dog and pony show for current and potential investors. I didn't realize I was basically going to be pitching a project for funding, so my anxiety was worse than I'd expected. If there was an 11 on the scale, I'd have been there." "So how did it go?" I asked her. "I just decided to treat it as an opportunity and to lean into the anxiety instead of trying to make it go away. And really, what was I going to do? Not give the presentation? So I just said to myself, this is not a comfortable situation for me, and I have no idea how it's going to go. Let's see where this takes me." And it went all right. I was terrified at first, but it got easier as I went along, and it looks like we'll have new investors for the project. When we do what we're afraid of, it's almost certainly going to be uncomfortable. We can resist that discomfort, or we can choose to embrace it. When we accept that it's going to be scary, the fear has less power over us. It will be uncomfortable, no better and no worse, just uncomfortable. We can lean into uncertainty just as we lean into discomfort. Rather than backing away from unknowns, we can tell ourselves, I don't know what will happen, and I'm willing to do it anyway. When you're facing your own fears, how can you encourage yourself to endure the inevitable discomfort and to accept the inherent uncertainty? Examples include reminding yourself it will be hard and why you're willing to do it anyway. Fostering an attitude of curiosity toward the experience. Let's see how this goes. Keeping in mind what motivated you to face your fears in the first place. Remembering that discomfort doesn't last forever. Tapping into your sources of strength. Knowing that few great things are achieved through avoidance. In your notebook, write what you'll remind yourself of when tempted to pull back from facing uncertain or uncomfortable situations. What is courage? Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than one's fear. Ambrose Redmoon. Tailoring exposure for different fears. While the general principles of exposure therapy hold for various types of anxiety, we can increase its effectiveness by adapting it for specific conditions. Specific phobias. Exposure for specific phobias tends to be the most straightforward. In many cases, a single extended exposure session can effectively treat the condition. For example, one study found that for 90% of people who did the treatment, about 2 hours of exposure led to lasting improvement or even complete recovery. The protocol can also be effective when done without therapist assistance. Exposures for phobias should allow you to test the assumptions you have about what will happen when you interact with the thing or situation you fear. For example, if you're afraid you'll get stuck in an elevator, riding an elevator allows you to test that prediction. If you struggle with a phobia, what do you think will happen if you confront it? Keep these predictions in mind. They'll come in handy when you make your own exposure hierarchy later in this chapter. Panic disorder. There are many ways exposure therapy can play a role in managing panic disorder. We'll start with the easiest one. Keep breathing. Keep breathing. The breath is intimately connected to our nervous systems. When we're feeling calm and relaxed, our breathing tends to be slow and steady. When we're afraid, we take rapid, shallow breaths. Take a few rapid, shallow breaths now and notice how you feel. Then take a few slow breaths and see what happens. When we're having frequent panic attacks, we tend to breathe in a way that increases physiological arousal and anxiety. By practicing a few minutes of relaxed breathing each day, we can lower our stress level. If you're working to manage panic, plan to spend 5 minutes per day breathing in the following way. 1. Inhale slowly for a count of 4. It's more important that the breath be slow than deep. Breathe into the belly as much as possible rather than the chest. Belly breathing will improve with practice. 2. Exhale slowly for a count of 4. 3. Pause for a count of 2 to 4 before your next inhale. You can also use this breathing technique during your exposure exercises. When we're facing a challenging situation and are worried about panicking, it can feel like we have no control over the situation. One thing we can control is where we focus our attention, and we can use the breath as a focal point to help us face our challenges. Keep in mind that the point of the breathing is to help you through your exposure, not to take away your anxiety or make sure you don't panic. If we use the breathing as a means to keep from panicking, it can backfire and lead to more anxiety. Remember, the point of focusing on the breath is to focus on the breath. Testing your predictions. If you have panic disorder, hopefully at this point you've reassessed some of your beliefs about panic. For example, we might think a panic attack can lead to suffocation or going crazy, when in fact a panic attack is not dangerous, just very distressing. We can further test our beliefs about panic through exposure exercises. What are some of the beliefs you have about what will happen if you panic? Have some of these fears been hard to counter simply through challenging your thoughts? For example, do you expect something bad to happen other than the panic itself? When you design your exposure hierarchy, think about the beliefs you have and how you might test them. Facing our fear of fear. In panic disorder, we often start to fear our own body's reactions because they become associated with panic. For example, we might start to fear having a fast heartbeat because our hearts race during panic. As a consequence, we might start avoiding activities that raise our heart rates, which further reinforces our fear. Like any activity we avoid out of fear, we can practice approaching physical symptoms to decrease the discomfort they bring. This type of exercise is called interoceptive exposure. Common activities and the symptoms they provoke include activity, corresponding sensations, activity breathing through a coffee stirrer for 1 minute, corresponding sensations, feeling of suffocation, running vigorously for 1 minute, racing or pounding heart, shortness of breath, taking 10 fast, deep breaths, hyperventilation, numbness in extremities, feeling unreal, or finally the activity of spinning in swivel chair and the corresponding sensations of dizziness. Have you developed any fears of bodily sensations related to panic? If so, which physical sensations are uncomfortable for you to experience? Write them down in your notebook, as well as activities that could produce those sensations. If you've become afraid of physical sensations, plan to include these activities in your hierarchy. Opening to panic. Trying not to panic often has the paradoxical effect of creating more panic. For many people, the most powerful antidote to panic is being willing to panic. Some people even describe a mindset of bring it on. When we're willing to have a panic attack, it makes us dread panic less, and it makes a panic attack less likely. Being willing to bring on panic-like symptoms through interoceptive exposure is in line with this mentality. You can also practice opening to specific symptoms you experience. For example, if your heart starts to race, let it, perhaps even willing it to beat faster. Most people I've worked with find this practice quite challenging because it goes against our natural impulse to try to make panic stop. At the same time, they tend to find it very helpful. Social anxiety disorder. CBT for social anxiety disorder includes customized techniques to address the specific cognitive components of the condition. Using exposures to test beliefs. Julie was afraid that people would be terribly bored and uncomfortable during her presentation. We worked to identify how she would know they were feeling these things. What would they be doing? How would it differ from their behavior when others were speaking to the group? During her presentation, Julie forced herself to look up and see how people were responding, even though she was afraid of what she would see. To her pleasant surprise, her coworkers looked about the same as ever. Some were checking their phones, some were listening intently, others were nodding. Being specific about what she expected to see and then comparing her prediction to what actually happened allowed for a fair test of Julie's beliefs. She concluded that her fears were unfounded in this case, and probably in others. If you'll be doing exposures for social anxiety, be sure to specify what you're afraid will happen and how you'll test whether it did. It's easy to rely on our gut feeling about how things went. If we're prone to a lot of social anxiety, our gut will be biased to believe we did badly. Consider a social situation you fear and what you're afraid might happen when you confront it. How could you set up an exposure to test your predictions? Dropping safety behaviors. I'm finding I don't have to do as much in social situations as I thought I had to, Julie told me. Like when I'd go out with friends, I'd constantly be thinking of what I was going to say next. I was so worried about any awkward pause in the conversation. What's it been like as you've let go of some of those things? I asked her. Well, I was surprised at first that the conversation didn't come to a screeching halt. I've been doing it for so long, I just assumed it was the only thing between me and these terrible silences. She paused. I guess I really feel like I'm in the conversation now. Before I was only 1/4 in it and 3/4 in my head, so I wasn't really hearing the other person. I was so focused on making sure I had something to say. Julie went on to say that one of her friends recently told her she really enjoyed talking with her because Julie was such a good listener. Julie was starting to see that she was a valued friend, not the socially awkward person others wanted to avoid like she'd assumed. Julie found that by dropping her safety behaviors, you can see them listed in the bonus materials, she was able to be herself more and be more present for others. Letting go of safety behaviors is especially important in social anxiety disorder because they can actually worsen our social abilities as well as lead us to believe we can't do well without them. Other examples of safety behaviors in social anxiety disorder include keeping my hands in my pockets so people don't see them shake, excessively rehearsing what I'm going to say before speaking, asking lots of questions to avoid talking about myself, relying on alcohol to relax in social situations. If you struggle with social anxiety, can you identify any of your own safety behaviors in social situations? What do you think are the advantages of using these behaviors? The disadvantages? Turning attention outward. As Julie prepared to do her exposures, we talked about where her attention is in social situations. I'm usually checking to see how I'm doing, she said. If I'm paying attention to the other person, it's often to try to see if I'm making them uncomfortable. She laughed. That's probably why I never remember people's names when we're introduced. I'm just trying to see if this person thinks I'm weird. As we discussed it further, Julie realized focusing on herself only increases her anxiety, which makes her more self-conscious, which leads to even greater anxiety. What would happen if you stopped focusing on yourself during conversations? I asked her. I don't know, she said. It might go better, but I also worry I'll be acting weird and making people feel awkward and I won't know it. She agreed to practice taking the spotlight off herself in her social interactions and see what would happen. Self-focus can be thought of as a type of safety behavior. Like other safety behaviors, it probably doesn't help us and likely makes things worse. When you're in uncomfortable social situations, how much of your attention is directed toward yourself and how you're coming across versus on the other person? If you find yourself being focused on yourself, what effects have you noticed? During your exposures for social anxiety, practice directing your attention away from yourself and what others think of you. You might choose to focus instead on the person you're talking with and what they are saying, or on being in the conversation, presentation, or whatever you're doing, rather than monitoring how you're doing. Generalized anxiety disorder, GAD. Most of the fears we've focused on so far have been about things that are unlikely to happen. Our plane crashing, for example, or what wouldn't be as bad as we think, like blushing in front of a group. When our anxiety is focused mainly on worries, our fear is based on our lack of control over the things we care about most. For example, we worry about our children's safety, or losing our parents, or our job security, or being in a major car accident. Anything that would involve tremendous disappointment, suffering, or loss. Even if we don't meet all the criteria for GAD, almost all of us worry more than we need to about things we can't control. Do you find yourself repeatedly worrying about things? If so, list some of your recent worries in your notebook. Worry as avoidance. It's hard to make an exposure hierarchy for worries. By definition, the anxiety and generalized anxiety disorder isn't confined to a specific set of situations or objects. Additionally, avoidance may not be as apparent as in conditions like panic disorder or specific phobia. Nevertheless, there is a version of exposure that can be helpful for the worry and cognitive avoidance, the effort to push certain fears out of one's mind that are part of GAD. The act of worrying itself can be an attempt, usually unintentional, to avoid thinking about really frightening things that could happen. For example, if we're terrified of losing our job and becoming homeless, our minds might cling to worries about things we have more control over, like getting to work on time. If we're afraid of losing our aging parents, we might focus our worries on making sure they take their medication. In the process, our minds are doing their best to push away the really scary image of being homeless, burying a parent, and other frightening prospects. The problem with pushing things out of our minds is that they tend to come back more often. In one classic study by Daniel Wegner and his fellow researchers, participants were told not to think of a white bear during a 5-minute period. Of course, the harder they tried not to think about it, the more often they did. Accepting what we fear. When we run from what we fear, it can make what we're afraid of seem worse than bad. Yet there's something about confronting our worries head-on that can make them less threatening. Thus, the antidote for avoiding thinking about our fears is to deliberately think about them. When we have worries about bad things happening, we can practice exposing ourselves mentally to the possibility that what we're afraid of could happen. For example, if I worry that I might get sick and miss a big family trip I've been looking forward to, my worries about missing the trip might lead me to think of everything I can do to avoid getting sick. Wash my hands, get adequate sleep, avoid people who are sick, and so forth. By worrying about these more mundane matters, I can push away the thought that I could miss the trip. Despite my best efforts, though, there's no way to be sure I won't miss the trip. As a result, my mind will continue to ask, what if you get sick, as the trip approaches? In this case, I could practice accepting the possibility that what I'm afraid of might happen. It's possible that I'll get sick and miss the trip and be really sad I wasn't with my family for this special occasion, I could tell myself. Most likely, we'll have an initial increase in anxiety from telling ourselves that what we fear might happen. However, if we continue to practice responding to our worries with acceptance, they tend to lose their sting and stop bothering us as much. If you're prone to worry that's hard to control, what are some statements that could help you practice accepting the uncertainty surrounding what you fear? Living in an imaginary future. When we worry about events that might happen, like losing our health or our loved ones, we can feel as though those events have already happened. In doing so, we suffer many times over, even before a challenging event has occurred. For example, if we dwell on an image of ourselves being stuck in a nursing home, lonely and depressed, we'll spend a lot of time feeling bad about something that might never happen. Can you think of a recent time when you were so worried about something that you felt like it was happening already? If so, describe it in your notebook. I like to pair accepting the possibility that what we worry about could happen with a return to the present, to what's actually going on. That way we neither run from our worries nor give them more airtime than they deserve. When you catch yourself worrying, practice acknowledging that what you're afraid of could happen. Then turn your attention back to whatever you're doing. It can be helpful to focus on sensory experiences, what you see, hear, smell, feel, and/or taste. Keep in mind that the point of returning to the present is not to avoid our fears, but to be more fully engaged in the reality of our lives. Creating your own hierarchy. Now it's time to put together your own exposure hierarchy. If you prefer, you can make your hierarchy in a spreadsheet so the items are easy to sort by difficulty level. If you want to use paper and pen, fill in the form which is in your bonus materials. Review the notes you've taken throughout this chapter to develop items that will be a part of your hierarchy. But keep in mind that you don't have to be able to do all of them at this time. As you work your way up, the more difficult ones will start to feel more doable. For the anxiety scale, use the following guidelines. Note that the absolute numbers are not that important. They just allow you to rank the difficulty of the activities. 0 equals no distress. 5 equals difficult but manageable. 10 equals most distress I've ever felt. The hierarchy form includes reminders of the key points to make your exposure successful. There are additional spaces at the bottom so you can add any other reminders you want to include for yourself. For example, you might include a reminder of what's more important than your fear. Fill out an exposure hierarchy, which can be found in your bonus materials. Reminders. Anxiety goes down when we face it. Work through your hierarchy progressively and systematically. Stay through discomfort. Eliminate unnecessary props and safety behaviors. Embrace discomfort and uncertainty. Planning items to complete. Review your exposure hierarchy. Where is a good starting point for you? Plan to start with activities that will be difficult but manageable. You'll want to set yourself up to succeed, so choose activities you're confident you can do. At the same time, if you have items ranked 1 or 2, you might want to pick something a bit more challenging so you can make the best use of your time. If you prefer to arrange the activities in order from easier to harder, reorder your activities on a blank exposure hierarchy form. Choose 2 or 3 of the activities that you feel you can complete this week. Activity 1. Activity 2. Activity 3. As with any activity you intend to complete, choose a time to do each one and add them to your calendar. If you plan to complete activities you're afraid of, this is a big day. You are on your way to conquering your fears. Chapter Check-in. You've now worked through 6 modules of this self-directed treatment. Congratulations on all the work you've done. Next week, we'll review what you've done as we put all the pieces together. You'll have the opportunity to take stock of the ground you've covered, the progress you've made, and the work you still need to do. For now, take a few moments to consider how you're feeling in week 6 of this program. What stands out to you from this chapter on facing your fears? Record your thoughts and feelings in your notepad. Activity Plan. 1. Continue completing your scheduled activities from your Getting Back to Life list. 2. Monitor your activities for 3 days using the Daily Activities form. 3. Be aware of your thinking, especially when you have a surge of negative emotion, and complete a Challenging Your Thoughts form as needed. 4. Continue completing tasks from week 5. 5. Complete the first few items from your exposure hierarchy at the times you planned. 6. Schedule a time to complete week 7.